What is going on, everyone? It's me, Troy, and I'm here, of course, again with another video, and it's about to start storming, so I got to decide, do I want to take a nap, or do I want to read the book that I'm currently reading? So it's going to be one or the other. It might be both, who knows, but at the end of the day, as long as there's some food in this house, I'm good to go, okay? You know, food and coffee. Anyway, I said that before all that, I said I'm gonna make sure I come up here and talk to you guys about what I read within the month of August, because August turned into the Nora Roberts month for some reason. Somehow it did. Like I got bit by the Nora Roberts, what's those things? Bot flies, a larvae. This is gross. We'll say in my reading spirit, not in my physical form, but my reading spirit up above. It got infested. The larvae came out, but it blossomed into this beautiful thing of configuration of reading Nora Roberts books and probably being hopeful and in receiving love through this vicarious series of books, and things happen. The point is that I'm here to share these books because one thing for sure is, as someone who is a deep fan of the J.D. Robb series, the in-depth series, who is of course Nora Roberts' pseudonym, over this my time reading those books, I would occasionally try to read a Nora Roberts book, and they are often DNFs or hits, finished hits or finished miss. So there's a lot of trepidation when it comes to that, but I do recognize that Nora Roberts, you know, when I really just kind of want a story, she's pretty decent, I guess you can say, at setting up premises that capture my interest. And the latest one that I really count myself wanted to give a good Judy old try to is our latest trilogy, the Lost Brides trilogy. So that's kind of what launched this month off, because I was like, well, I really want to see what's going on in these books. So the first book that I read this month was, well, the month of August, was The Inheritance, which is the first book in the Lost Brides trilogy. This has to do with this woman named Sonia. She is a graphic designer, but what happens is that, you know, at the beginning of the book, she finds her fiance in bed with her cousin, you know, yada yada yada. You know, they break up. She really never liked him anyway, you know, because he's a, you know, a d bag and all that kind of stuff. But a man comes knocking on her door one day with an inheritance. She inherited this manor house in Maine, and for her to get not only the house, but as well as the, I think about 5% of the residuals in regards to the inheritance and the company is attached to. She has to live within the house for 3 years. The inheritance came about through the death of an uncle that she did not know she had. So it plays with that trope of, you know, lost inheritance and suddenly coming into wealth sort of thing. So, you know, Sonya, at this particular breaking point at the start of the series, she more or less reluctantly decides to take on this manor house, go live there, start over, start fresh, quit her job, and escape, you know, the trauma of her ex-fiance who was slowly and tormenting her, you know. But anyway, that's the beginning of The Inheritance. And of course, as it regards romance, she falls in love, or they fall in love with each other. You know, the lawyer who approached her, his son, Troi. So that's The Inheritance. And then after The Inheritance is The Mirror, which is the second book in the trilogy that further alongs this story. Now, the reason I'm showing them to there now is because you're probably thinking, okay, well, what is the conflict? The conflict is that inside of this manor house, there is a slew, a number of ghosts. 95% of them are benevolent, but there's that 1 5%, or that one very specific one that is not. There is a haunting, tormenting, crazy ghost living in this manor house by the name of Hester Dobbs. Hester Dobbs is a witch. She was a witch when she was alive, and she's a witch while she's dead. And Hester Dobbs has placed a curse over this manor house, in which, her primary goal to that launched this curse was that as a witch, she wanted to be the lady of the manor house. You know, the second book explores more of that, but I think hopefully some more go into that in the third book, because I wasn't satisfied with what they gave me in the second book. But the point is that, you know, per her maintaining the curse, you know, that deep-seated grievance that she has, that she was never chosen as to be the woman of the house. You know, she goes about spending generations after generations murdering brides within the family. You know, that consists of 7 of them, and they all die in these unique circumstances. One is killed by spider bites, one is poisoned, one has hypothermia and dies in a cold. But you know, the core is that Hester Dobbs wants to maintain that no woman should ever get married within this house and be the woman of the house without, you know, she basically has an oversight on who gets to thrive and who doesn't within this manor house. So Sonia, as well as her new boyfriend and her best friend and her cousin that she's introduced to, they gather all these different clues and whatnot that's generating them in the direction of breaking the curse. Because Hester Dog does a lot of terrible things within the house. You know, she likes to slam doors, she likes to bust open windows, she likes to sort of give these characters in these positions where she's just fueling them with these nightmarish images, and she's just terrorizing them. You know, she's very much repellent by joy and happiness and love. And given that these books, you know, the core orbiting center of these books revolve around love, Nora Roberts, and romance, you know, Hester Dobbs is just fired up. And I like Hester Dobbs, to be honest with you. I like Hester Dobbs. I'd be like, yeah, every time Hester Dobbs come up here and start her mess, I'd be like, go girl, go get him, Hester Dobbs, go ahead, go get him. And the reason I say that is because as interesting as these books are for me, they can kind of wear themselves then, both the inheritance and the mirror, because Nora Roberts repeats a lot of things, a lot of activities. When you kind of peel back the veil when it comes to the inheritance and the mirror, there isn't a whole lot there. There's something there that's it would have to have been for me to continue reading the first two books, and am very much invested in reading the third and final book when it comes out in November. I'm gonna be right at the bookstore because I want to see what Hester Dobbs is gonna do or how they're gonna defeat her. But when I say when you pull back the veil, there isn't a lot there. These books, although if I kind of like separate the two glowing pieces of interest and the piece of interest that is so repetitive that it can be a little droning to the senses, you know, the things that pull me the most is the relationship between the characters within the book. Those are the things I like most. The interactions, the growing, just it took a while for me to warm up to them, but just the whole, I will say, just kind of like posse, if you will, of Sonia, Troi, Owen, and Cleo, you know, the four main protagonists. You know, that's the thing that I liked most, kind of, was their interactions with one another. So that was pleasant. But I think underneath that, the thing that I loved the most, or was much more hungry about receiving more of, was the instances in which the characters will go and explore the historic relevance of all the different wives who were killed within the home by Hester Dobbs and the curse, the victims of the curse. You know, there's these each individual moments in which they can kind of, well, mainly Sonia gets a glimpse, a premonition of sorts, where she learns about each of these different women, how they die. You know, one from hypothermia, being drawn out into the cold, one from a spider bite, one from a poisoned cupcake, all delivered through the machinations of the entity known as Hester Dobbs. It's kind of funny because, you know, we're looking at generations, so you don't know quite how much power Hester Dobbs has, because clearly she's deceased, clearly she's a ghost, clearly there's a curse, but she somehow manages to, you know, exact these sort of traumas and deaths on these characters. So that's the stuff that I love. Those are the main draws for me, was just the interactions between the characters, watching Sonia, you know, as a lady who at the beginning of the book, the beginning of the series, she's rather defeated after finding out her fiance was cheating on her. But like I said, she didn't care because she didn't like him anyway. But and the characters going about piecing together the history of the manor. And then in the second book, The Mirror, where we get much more of them piecing together specifically the lineage of Sonia and her particular family, dating back to her great-great-great-great-grandfather, and much more via Hester Dobbs. And I like the fact that how Nora Roberts did that was she sort of pushed Sonia to go through this mirror, that's why it's called Mirror, that allows her to be a ghost in that particular time in which, unfortunately, one of the wives passed away. So those are the things I like. The ghost stuff, I'm digging. I'm digging the ghost stuff. it's a hooky kooky, but I'm kind of digging it. Yeah, as long as there's like that dangling carrot of um, sort of like when you write a book, there's this promise of some great revealance. It's going to be pleasing to the experience overall. To put the icing on the cake, I'm pretty much intact and glued there. But when we look at the other side of things, the things that really bug the crap out of me about these books are the ghosts at the same time. And it's not so much the wives, it's so much the non-wives ghosts, with the exception of one. That and the constant references to taking the dogs and the cat out to walk, that and the decorating of the manor house, and this enthusiasm to throw this party or whatnot that's inviting all the community who was once pretty much reluctant to even step near the house, to retransform the reputation of the house, if you will. That stuff got on my nerves. I was so tired of it, and a lot of the things in that part of the story was just too cheesy and corny for me. But I will say the biggest offender that made me roll my eyes the most was the ghost of Sonia's grandmother. Her name is Clover, or nickname Clover. She gave childbirth in the mid-60s and passed away via Hester Dobbs. Clover was a character who loved music, so all throughout the first two books, or all the books in general, Clover would like to play these cheesy songs on people's phones and laptops related to whatever conversation that they're having. Like, for example, Sonia building deepening her bond with her cousin Owen on her uncle's side of the family. Then there's Clover playing the song "We Are Family" on the iPad. Suddenly popping up. There was a lot of that, and each and every time Clover did that mess, I was like, oh my god, this is so freaking corny and cheesy. Like, I cannot. Another thing is there's this ghost named Molly. Molly happens to be a maid. Molly does things like make up the beds when the characters aren't looking, pull out the clothes for the characters. I was just like, first of all, the caricature and trope of Molly the maid is killing me. It's like, will somebody please exorcise Molly? And then there's this ghost of Jack who happens to be playing with, Sonia and Troi's dog, with a red ball. That stuff for me, those three bugged the crap out of me. I was just like, I'm so sick and tired of these ghosts, because to me they just kind of felt like a pinch of filler, when I would like to be, when I'm much more invested in the story of the much more tragic figures, if you will, like the brides and the brides' husbands. But I ultimately, I really did enjoy these books, The Inheritance and then followed by The Mirror. I won't say that they really delivered everything that I was kind of hoping to see, but in terms of storytelling, they did keep me engrossed. They did keep me hopeful for whatever it is. Hopeful in the sense that I feel like it's going to be good and not so much dim, but for the sense of what the resolution is going to be toward the end of the third and final book. So I'm tapped in, I'm tuned into the Lost Brides trilogy by Nora Roberts. Just that, like I said, there's some repetition in things that just kind of bug the crap out of me that I deeply, deeply, deeply could do without. But I'm still there. I'm still plugged in. And I guess that's to be expected. But they leave on a cliffhanger, and we'll just see what's going on in the third book, because The Mirror left off on a crazy note, a Stephen King kind of note. So continue with my reading of Nora Roberts in the month of August. I finally read the book Black Hills. Finally read this book, Black Hills, baby. This book came out in 2009. I tried to read this book in 2009, but could not do it. At that time, I was working at a bookstore, and when you work at a bookstore, you can check out books. So this lady I was working with, she knew I loved J.D. Robb, so she was like, "You got to read Nora Roberts." She was like, "This is her latest book, Black Hills. Check this book out." I checked it out. I couldn't get into it. But it always sat in the back of my mind that I wanted to read this book and explore this book. And here we are, probably about 16 years later, where I read this book through and through, and I enjoyed it. I really did. I enjoyed it. I think that when we just kind of look at the synopsis, I can probably express why I want to read this book so much. But it has to do with this woman named Leo, who owns or runs this wildlife refuge in the Black Hills. You know, adjacent to Leo is a man named Cooper, a man who once resided within New York, who makes his way to the Black Hills as a child. You know, the beginning of the book starts with them forming a relationship and a bond as children, then coming back to them being teenagers and falling in love, and then they both have their own different paths throughout life. You know, Coop knows for sure that some of the damage that he has received per his relationship with his parents, who wanted him to be something that he's not. You know, he knows that he has to find himself while being ensured to know that Leah knows exactly what her path is going to be. So they separate. And then there's an incident that takes place with Coop's grandfather where he returns back to the Black Hills. And then that's when the two of them start to begin to, you know, with some hesitation on Leah's part, they begin to reignite their relationship. The big glowing issue between them is that as teenagers, they discovered this body on one of the trails in the Black Hills. And then subsequently, here we are at the present day where those bodies, or there's this dark, lurking figure who is trampesing through the Black Hills, has found himself or herself setting their sights on Leo, you know, to hurt Leo. So Coop has to protect Leo, and Leo has to operate this wildlife refuge. So the Black Hills, I think that because of that setting of the Black Hills, that's why I really want to read this book, both then and I guess my much more mature brain could handle it now steadily, because I like that theme of a character such as Leo being outside of sort of like the corporate world, but she's a character who is much more rustic and organic and part Native American, and she is a woman who is about the land, about animals and prey and predator. She has that understanding that what's that biology of animals. There's more to it than that, but that's just kind of what's coming on the top of my brain. But at the center of that, I understood that Nora Roberts was playing with a theme here, a theme of hunting, a theme of stalking, a theme of being resourcefulness, a theme of overcoming. You can see all that throughout the whole circular motion of this particular book as you read it. As you come into contact with, you know, Leo facing, you know, this evilness, we'll say, that's lurking within the Black Hill, a person who has dubbed her prey, a person who she sees as predator, a person which they have to reverse roles, you know, in order for her to be able to stop him, to protect, you know, only herself, but her family, as you'll see, as well as her refuge, as he goes about doing things that are sabotaging her dreams and her goals. So I really love that. And I love that parallel of not only just predator and prey when it comes to, you know, we're looking at the particular animals, the Krugers, the tigers, etc., the big cats. And then we're looking at the hunter, the huntress, and the hunted when it comes to Leo. But when it comes to the relationship things, where Coop is slowly trying to pull Leo back in, and Leo is slowly stalking away until eventually that starts to twist around where she's stalking much more closer to her here. So it's all that sort of, I don't want to say animalistic, but it's all that that synchronized pulling towards one another, that, you know, is the center of this book when it comes to relationships, that I actually really enjoyed reading about. And I think I enjoyed reading about it because it had a touch of drama to it, but it wasn't too much. It had, I guess you can say, it had some reasonable drama to it. Like, I could understand why, you know, when scenes filled with dialogue where the two of them are going back and forth, I could understand why they may respond to one another in the way they do. Sort of like how Leah throws up her walls when it comes to Coop, and Coop has to try to knock him down. It wasn't too dramatic for me, to the point where I cringe. It was like, at this point, I was pretty much connected with these characters to the point where I hungered for them to have these conversations with one another so that they can lay the groundwork to build back up their relationship. So the Black Hills left on a good note. The only really thing I can say about it that was more or less, or it had a little tepid feel to it, is that it was predictable. It was pretty much predictable. And that's primarily just looking at the theme itself, as I just expressed. It was pretty much predictable how a lot of the things were going to take place. But it was still a great book. And yeah, I'm glad that 16 years later, I finally got a chance to complete reading it. So after I read Black Hills, I read Hidden Nature by Nora Roberts. This is her latest book. This one came out in May 20th, something like that. But here's Hidden Nature. Every time I look at it, I want to say Hidden Valley. Okay, so this is the last book that I read this month, and it's her latest book. But this one has to do with this natural resource officer named Sloan. At the beginning of the book, Sloan has just, closed out a case with her partner. They're driving alone. They have to get some gas, and she goes into a convenience store to get a snack, I believe. She ends up stopping this robbery that takes place, and she gets shot. So she gets injured. She lays on the operating table. She dies on the table. Her heart stops, and she's having this out of body experience. And then she's, subsequently, of course, sucked back into her body, and then she's at this point where she's like in convalescence, where she has to put her job on hold, like what FMLA. She has to go move back in with her parents, who own this sort of resort village by the lake where they rent out these cabins, and she has to heal herself and come back to grips with herself and try to reclaim her steps as a natural police officer, natural source police officer. She has a very interesting job, which is another reason why I generally am kind of pulled to, or have curiosity when it comes to reading Nora Roberts' book, because a lot of times the premises and then the jobs or careers these characters have are something that is interesting. So I want to see how she works all those things in. So, but just to quickly shoot through and define it, Sloan is like someone who makes sure that people are following certain, natural resource laws, use a certain kind of bait when you're fishing within this lake, don't introduce invasive species. She gets on the boat, check for licenses, check out people who are erecting these campgrounds and that sort of thing. So interesting stuff in there. But on the flip side, while she is in convalescence back at her family's home, because it's a thriller with a romance primarily as the core of the story, but it has the sensational thrillerness of it. There's this couple who are traveling around within the region near her home, collecting people, and I'm not going to say why, and murdering them. But Sloan essentially is primed to be one of their victims, and of course eventually they all come to a head with one another. And then of course in the middle of all that is Sloan falling in love with a gentleman and his brother, who have a very acrimonious relationship with their mother and father, and decide to move from New York into this area and start rehabbing this house. And then they all get in connection with one another and fall in love. Hidden Nature was a great book for me in the first part, the first act. The first act was amazing to me because not only the setup of the character of Sloan and her particular, a description of her particular role as an officer, but what made her so human to me was her being in convalescence, her being in physical therapy, her having to relearn or to gain her strength when it comes to walking. And of course, when you have physical trauma to yourself and have to recover, that equals mental, and sometimes, a lot of times, vice versa. She was a character who could only do so much of what she previously was able to do, and I love that limitation on her. I love that drive. I loved how one scene Nora Roberts had Sloan so defeated, that she couldn't get back to her job. She couldn't get back to work, but she was so defeated that she just took a pair of scissors and just started cutting her hair off. And I was like, ooh, she's coming alive on the page. I was like, ooh, I like stuff like this. Because I know that she has to overcome that. And that's why we read some of these books, is because of, their challenges and that characters have to overcome. But what saddened me, and I'm just going to keep it real, what saddened me was that probably after, maybe when we got into the second act, a lot of that complications with this character evaporated. She healed, essentially. Most primarily she healed, and she went back to work at her job, which of course I found interesting, but it wasn't as interesting. Wasn't as interesting as her struggles to heal. But she healed and she went back to her job, and it kind of felt like we just turned off the A switch and went right on to turn on the B switch, where she was complete back in her role. Although she was still adjusting to the decision that she wanted to live back near her parents, live back in this cabin by the lake that she's putting together. But at the same time, with all of that, she has caught, or the attention of these criminals in the area has caught her attention, and then she has to go about solving the crime, tracing all these things. For someone who reads a lot of J.D. Robb books, there was a lot of feeling of E. Dallas and Rourke in here when it comes to the character Sloane and her love interest, which I forgot to mention his name. His name is Nash. There was a lot of that in here. I really felt like Eve and Rourke was on the page in some instances. But, I was just kind of hoping that it would have taken the entirety of the book for her to eventually come out of this despair, because that was just much more glowing human parts of her. And it's almost like, or what I kind of anticipated, is sort of like this book by Josephine Tey called, it's called The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, where her main protagonist actually solved a historic mystery via a painting while laying in a hospital bed the entire book. I was kind of looking for something sort of like that, where there was just that bit of a limitation for Sloane throughout the entirety of the book, to the point where about time we got to the end of the book, she'll be in a place in which she had to pull through every bit of strength she had to overcome the villains within the story. So with that out of the way, the book became much more predictable. You could see exactly where it's going from a mile away, because she was better and good to go. It became a procedural story of capturing these two criminals, mixed in with the romance. It became predictable. So it lost its luster a little bit for me, because I just enjoyed those areas so much where the character Sloane was not 100%, both physically and mentally. That just stapled her. Those scenes where she were downtrodden, those just stapled her as so much more alive on the page for me, and I want to see her gradually come out of that. But it was a decent book. It was still a decent thriller as an open thriller, because of the interest primarily when it came to the villains. But they were kind of cartoonish to me. They very much reminded me of the villains in Devoted in Death. Very cartoonish in a lot of ways. So, I could only take them seriously so much because they were so over the top, but I still think that the reason for why they were doing the murders that they were doing was still something that drew me in. Unfortunately, although those things all was great, the thing that really bound me the most when it came to reading Hidden Nature was the constant references to rehabilitation projects when it comes to homes. For a while, I was okay with it. I found it interesting, but we're looking at a book that compounded not one but two homes, 2.5, because by the end of the book, the B couple bought a home, and that's the first thing they got into, was what they wanted to do with it. It was compounding all these different homes and rehabilitation talks over and over again. To the point where I just kind of cringed at a lot of it. It was just so cheesy and corny to me. constantly, this chair looks fabulous. I need this mud room and all of this, and it's just like I don't think it wasn't bothersome. It would not have been as bothersome if in the back of my head I wouldn't think that this book could be cut shorter if we would just kind of do away with some of this over expressive detail in rehab in a home and all these various steps that the characters will want to use to do it all with the fireplace and stuff. Yeah, I was just kind of like yeah, more or less. Unfortunately, though, I do want to say, like, at the end of Hidden Nature, the wind did come out of the sail for me, during the second and the final act. I was still invested. I was still engrossed. I did appreciate the relationship between Sloane and Nash and how, they kind of talked about their trouble, or his particular troubled past, that stuff that I would kind of expect. But, yeah, I think that, like I said, I mentioned at this point that really, that best, shiny, good stuff had to do with Sloane. Had to do with Sloane injured. That's where the best part of the book was for me. And I just kind of wished that it would have, like I said, would have continued gradually throughout the book. But, it didn't. So, once she kind of got on her feet, she was pretty much on her feet. But I enjoyed the investigative portions and police procedural portions from that anyway. Only because they really just kind of put me in the mind frame of Rourke and Eve. So, I finished reading Hidden Nature. And I think I might go back and read like something from Nora Roberts that like The Sanctuary or Whiskey Beach. You will have to let me know what is probably the best one to read by her. And I really do want to read. I did find a copy at Ollie's of Identity, as that has to do with a bartender who has her identity stolen. That sounds, that's what I'm talking about. Those premises is what pull me in, but sometimes they just don't land all the way by the end. And Mind Game. So we'll see. I'll be on the Nora Roberts lookout. So that is my talk about Hidden Nature. I keep wanting to say Hidden Valley, but it's not a valley. Although they do kind of in a valley, but it's not a valley. So that's it. Thank y'all for tuning in, and that's kind of it.